My name is Ed Whittingham. I'm Executive Director of the Pembina Institute. Welcome to Calgary, where we have our largest office. And welcome to Alberta from those of you who are from outside the province. We've arranged for very nice weather for you today. And I can say we also have lively politics and economics to offer our visitors. It's been particularly lively for the local folks. I hope you're able to experience it while you're here, and it's actually germane to today's topic. All of this reminds me of a great Gable cartoon that ran in the Globe a few years back, and I might be committing moderator suicide here by trying to describe a cartoon in my introductory comments, but allow me to try nonetheless. Imagine a sort of a room in Ottawa with a sign that says Strategic Economic Planning Center on the wall, and you've got two bureaucrats who are clad as lumberjacks, complete with their flannel hunting caps, with the flaps, and their flannel jackets. Where I grew up in Ontario, we used to call that a Keswick dinner jacket. So I lived down the road in Newmarket, and that was our hockey rival. In front of them, there's a screen with the title Market Report, and it's got two lines. Drawing of water, meh, with an arrow going down. Hewing of wood, meh. And the caption is, dang, eh? And that's perhaps a fitting summary of the challenge that our province faces and the province you're visiting, the pickle that we're in. A province that has been historically tied to the oil and gas industry and the rapid cycling commodity prices that are attached to it. And that's why we're heartened to see today's conversation. And I think of Velma's comment of, if we were to capture just 1% of a soon-to-be $2.2 trillion world economy in clean tech, that could be an industry the size of the aerospace industry. And that's also why, in my one bit of editorializing for today, at Pembina we're heartened to see some steps being taken in this province to broaden the economic base. But I'll save my editorializing for the pages of the Edmonton Journal and the Herald if you want to read my little commentary that's running today and tomorrow. But that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here is to follow up on the first panel from this morning that gave us great context, I think, for Canada's innovation performance generally, and more specifically, some of the opportunities to improve our innovation performance around clean tech specifically. So our second panel is going to unpack really the topic of today's workshop, and that's the links between public policy and clean innovation. Tackling a few really important questions that I know we're all interested in. So what do we know about how policy drives clean innovation? What are the policy opportunities and challenges for Canada? How can we learn from examples to the south of us in the US and international examples? And what would be an appropriate balance for Canada between the carrot policies, like R&D grants, write-offs, tax credits, loan guarantees for clean tech, versus the stick policies like a price on carbon, which we know in this year, the great year of climate policy discussion, is at the forefront of that discussion. To do that, we've got a great group of speakers. Now, a couple things, housekeeping notes. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, just top line, essentially their title and their affiliation. If you want more, you can look at the bios in your package. And the other thing is just to help keep our speakers on time in case they need it. Now, the last panel did very well, but I don't know about you folks. I'll be giving you, I don't know, we'll see. But I'll be giving you the 2-minute warning when you're within 2 minutes of the end of your time. And I'll be using the old theater convention when you're out of time. This says, find an ending. Find an ending. And that means to wrap up. So, on to our speakers, and I will introduce them all at once and then just let them go and speak in order. So we've got Dr. Richard Newell, and Richard is the Gendel Professor of Energy and Environmental Economics at the Nicholas School of the Environment, Duke University, and Director of the Duke University Energy Initiative. He'll kick off. Going second, we have another Richard, Dr. Richard Hawkins, who is a professor here in the Science, Technology, and Society program at the University of Calgary. Going third, we've got Nick Johnstone. Dr. Nick Johnstone is head of the Structural Policy Division of the Directorate for Science, Technology, and Industry. And then lastly, we've got a soon-to-be doctor, Jeff McCartney, who is research director at the convener for today's discussion, Sustainable Prosperity, and he is currently completing his PhD in Sustainable Development at Columbia University. That's it for me, so without any further ado, Richard Newell.
Thanks, thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Good morning, and thanks to Stuart for organizing a very stimulating event, and to the sponsors of the conference for organizing it. I'm going to focus my remarks today on energy innovation and its implications for sustainable growth. Let me first give you a brief introduction to the Duke University Energy Initiative and how that plays into the broader framework of energy challenges faced here in Alberta, in North America, and around the world. The Duke University Energy Initiative is a multidisciplinary university-wide collaboration focused on advancing an accessible, affordable, reliable, and clean energy system. The initiative cuts across business, science, engineering, arts and sciences, and the environment. We're focused on educating future innovators, creating new solutions through research, and engaging with business and government leaders to improve energy decisions. You can learn more about the initiative at our website, energy.duke.edu, and sign up for a list if you're curious about what's going on at Duke University. So we at Duke, like much of the world, are focused on three main challenges related to the sustainable use of energy. And as I'll describe, energy innovation is what we need to strive for in order to find solutions to these challenges. First is the economic implications of energy. The production and use of energy is deeply interwoven with the larger history of human development. The ability to harness ever larger amounts of energy with increasing efficiency has been central to and inseparable from the improvements in living standards and economic prosperity improved and achieved in many parts of the world. Increased access to affordable energy has been a leading factor in the improvement of the quality of life for billions of human beings. So meeting energy demand is a very important challenge, and it forces us to ask several questions. How do we meet growing demand for energy to support a competitive and prosperous economy? What fuels should we pursue most vigorously? What technologies should we seek to develop? And what support can market and policy institutions play for the needed innovation? If that isn't challenge enough, people also need a healthy environment for themselves, for their children, and for future generations. The reality is that energy production and use can have very substantial environmental impacts. So we have our second major challenge, which is to reduce the environmental impact of energy on our air, our land, and our water. Major progress has been made over the years and over the decades, especially in developed economies such as Canada, the United States, and Europe, but further innovation is necessary. How do we satisfy global demand for energy while protecting our environment? What innovations will be necessary to make this achievable? That's especially true with regard to the implications of energy for climate change. Simply put, unless low-carbon energy can be brought to market at significantly lower cost and at much greater scale, it will be very difficult to achieve the substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's energy security. Energy is a strategic commodity with deep connections to foreign policy, geopolitics, economic resilience, and national security. Energy security also relates to the reliability of the electric grid, the security of energy infrastructure, and the safety and security of nuclear material, as we're seeing in ongoing discussions. What are the key elements of energy security, which at times is an ill-defined concept? What market policy and technology options do we have for improving energy security, and what types of innovation will be needed to achieve energy security goals? Allow me to go a bit more deeply into each of these three themes, as well as provide some projections as to what these challenges might look like in the future. Looking forward, global energy is on a path to grow 30 to 50% over the next 25 years. The vast majority of that growth is likely to be in Asia and the Middle East. As these and other fast-growing economies expand, populations expand, and people attain higher standards of living. Well over 1 billion people currently do not have access to electricity. While we're seeing many efforts in China and other developing nations to reduce environmental impacts, the imperative for most developing nations, unsurprisingly, tends to be providing the energy their populations need to develop economically. As these nations become wealthier, their populations will seek the same standards of living as those of us in this room, with personal transportation, reliable heating and cooling equipment, and easy access to electricity. In contrast, in the United States, Europe, and other modern economies, total energy consumption will likely remain flat or even decline. Coal and oil consumption appears to have peaked in the United States back in 2005, 2006. As advanced industrialized economies have developed, they've become significantly more efficient, and they've also become more oriented toward services compared to manufacturing, allowing energy consumption to grow more slowly than the economy as a whole. Additionally, policy measures in OECD countries have increased energy efficiency and decreased the share of energy generated from fossil fuels such as coal and oil. The economic imperative for energy innovation is to meet these growing demands while supporting a competitive and prosperous global economy. Competitiveness relates not only to the cost of energy as an input, but also to the participation of countries in global energy technology and fuel markets. The fact that the countries and regions that will be driving global energy demand trends over the next 25 years differ from those that have driven those trends in the past underscores the importance of international dialogue in addressing both the challenges and the opportunities we jointly face. Under current policy and technology trends, the energy sources that are currently projected to satisfy much of this increase are largely fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas, the same energy sources that helped modernize Canadian, US, and European economies. But at the same time that we see economic growth, we're also aware of the environmental implications of energy use. As everyone in this room knows, growing energy consumption, whether it's in Alberta, Houston, or Beijing, has important environmental implications. Today, oil, coal, and natural gas are the workhorses, providing over 80% of US and global energy use. They're the energy lifeblood of modern economies. Unfortunately, fossil fuels also contribute the majority of both conventional and global warming emissions. Most projections show that greenhouse gas emissions will need to fall substantially from today's levels for the world to prevent the most damaging impacts of climate change. To prevent these damages, innovations in the energy sector will be needed to reduce the cost of key technologies, including increased deployment of renewables, energy efficiency, nuclear power, and natural gas. We'll also need to deploy carbon capture and storage technology, which has the potential to capture carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and industrial sources and store them, hopefully indefinitely, underground. Just last year, I visited in Saskatchewan the Boundary Dam power plant station where they were about to power up a new 110 megawatt coal power unit that will capture about 90% of its emissions. Over 1 million tons of carbon dioxide will be captured each year in the largest post-combustion power plant to date. Most of it will be sold to the nearby Wyburn oil fields and injected underground for enhanced oil recovery, and some will be injected into a test facility for a deep underground saline aquifer. My understanding is the facility opened last October, so hopefully that's going as planned. Energy is also a major use of water, and as global populations grow, the conservation and efficient use of water will become increasingly important. For the United States and Canada, the environmental impacts of energy are less severe than they are in other parts of the world, but they're similar in character to what they are elsewhere. Climate change may affect North America in a variety of ways: rising sea levels, changing weather and rainfall patterns, and other effects. For this reason, and given the inevitability of some degree of climate change, there has also been an increased attention to adaptation, which also in turn requires innovation. Security is the third major theme, and when it comes to energy security, oil receives the most attention. Oil is particularly tied to the transport sector, supplying almost 95% of global transportation energy needs. This almost complete reliance on a single fuel for an essential sector raises obvious concerns. But security also plays a role in managing nuclear material. It plays a role in ensuring the safety and security and reliability of the electrical grid and of oil and natural gas pipeline networks. Across the globe, the security imperative is to create an energy system that is both less exposed to risk and is more resilient in the face of disruptive events. This includes reducing our exposure to risk through increased energy efficiency and diversifying through the development and deployment of a variety of alternative options. This is analogous to financial portfolio management. You don't put all your money in stocks, and what you do put in stocks you place in a diversified portfolio. In the context of electricity, for example, this means increased efficiency, it means a diversity of supply sources, and increasingly it could mean distributed power along with central station power. But while diversity helps us hedge, it also raises its own new reliability issues, which need solutions in the form of demand response, energy storage, and integrated planning. So we have three major challenges, and these economic, environmental, and security challenges are set to intensify unless innovation opens up our energy options. And it must open them up not just at a local level, regional level, but really must open them up at a global level if we're to really address issues like climate change. Given the breadth of the nature of the risks, the solutions need to have very wide applicability. And given society's simultaneous desire for an energy system that meets economic and security goals at the same time that it meets environmental goals, we need to think broadly about the implications of energy innovation for sustainable growth, not in an isolated, stovepiped fashion. So challenges of this scale can seem overwhelming, especially if you have several issues that overlap in a complex way. On the other hand, you can embrace these challenges and opportunities, and I think the people in this room are certainly in the latter category. There's trade-off among these three desires, but the goal, I think, should be to move forward on multiple fronts at the same time, not make progress on one front while setting ourselves back on others. Historically, many energy policies have been aimed at the encouragement of deployment of existing technologies. However, an even more important determinant of the energy future and key to finding solutions is innovation. Energy innovation opens up opportunities, it expands our options, it reduces costs, it increases performance, and it creates new value. But as we all know, innovation is itself not simple, and some other facts about the energy system need to be kept in mind that distinguish it from other parts of the economy. The size of the energy system is immense. Every day, the world consumes 90 million barrels of oil. It's up to 92 million barrels a day now. 20 million tons of coal, and 9 billion cubic meters of natural gas. That's every day. The energy capital stock is very widely dispersed in the economy, and it's very long-lasting. Cars last over a decade, power plants last several decades, buildings can be around for centuries. And much of the energy system is in the hands of the private sector, with annual investments measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So to be useful and practicable, innovations must scale up to meet the massive needs of the energy system. Innovations must make economic sense within the market and policy setting faced by the private sector. And innovations will necessarily take significant time to unfold and have an impact at the local, national, and global levels. So what is needed to advance the process of energy innovation? Past experience suggests that there's three key ingredients that tend to accelerate innovation, not just in energy, but across many sectors of the economy. The first ingredient is substantial, sustained, and effectively managed funding for research and development that is tightly linked to the private sector. The second is robust demand for new products and innovation. And the third is a vibrant, competitive private sector. Each of these three elements have tended to underpin innovation, not just in energy, but in many sectors such as health, information technology, and agriculture. First, the role of fundamental research as an engine of innovation is well documented, but it's difficult for private firms to fully support on their own due to near-term decision horizons and difficulty in capturing all of the payoff from innovation. As a result, government support and other forms of collaboration, some of which we've heard of today, are needed to help step up and step in and support this kind of fundamental research. Supplementary public support tends to involve a number of different approaches, ranging from broad-based R&D tax credits, public funding for basic scientific research, energy-focused applied research development and demonstration. Very importantly, it also involves support for education and training so that we have the necessary human capital base to underpin the innovative process. The stability of research and development effort is key, given the long time frames often required for innovative effort. highly variable funding streams tend to be disruptive to the innovative process and in the building and sustaining of human capital. Despite the importance of fundamental research, however, energy innovation does not simply flow like spring water from laboratories to fulfill our energy needs. Instead, innovation depends crucially on a second key ingredient of success, demand. That is what we individually demand, what industry demands, and what society and government policy demands from the energy fuels and technologies we buy. The market can do a superb job of incentivizing the private sector to deliver the kinds of innovation we need, so long as demand is pulling the innovation in a direction that reflects economic, environmental, and the security challenges I've discussed. Once that value is created, we know that innovators will get to work finding ways to lessen the cost of reducing emissions and meeting other energy goals. Market demand is important to innovation for at least two reasons. First, because the ability to make profits is essential for driving innovation and investment. And second, because feedback from the marketplace is essential for pointing innovative effort in a direction that continues to meet the demands of consumers and firms. Now, natural economic forces and strong private incentives for achieving certain goals already exist, such as delivering a growing supply of energy to meet the needs of both the industrialized and developing world. For example, the dramatic expansion of North American natural gas and oil production over the last decade through the application of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing to shale formations, and also here in Canada through the development of oil sands, reminds us that these sources, which may be thought of as relatively mature relative to renewables and other types of power, they're still capable of very significant and sometimes surprising degree of innovation. But due to externalities, government policy tends to be needed to create a value for reducing emissions and enhancing security. To meet these goals, especially environmental goals, the importance of inducing demand for clean energy innovation in the private sector is not just icing on the cake, it is absolutely essential if one is to imagine significant change. The reason is that the private sector is both the engine of innovation as well as the principal customer. The vast majority of R&D takes place in the private sector, and the vast majority of relevant equipment decisions will take place in the private sector, by industry, by businesses, and by households. When it comes to environmental concerns like climate change, the policy favored by most economists and many others is to place a value on emissions reductions that drives a clear, consistent, and predictable price on greenhouse gas emissions. This can be accomplished through either a carbon tax or a market-based cap-and-trade system. Where will the future of energy innovations occur? Understandably, there is great enthusiasm about the prospect for many renewable energy technologies. Projections indicate that globally the consumption of renewable energy is set to more than double over the next 25 years, a faster increase than any other source. A persistent challenge for clean energy, however, is that it usually appears indistinguishable from other sources of energy at the point of sale. Caveats aside, most people tend to demand light, heat, and mobility, not electricity from wind as opposed to coal, or transportation fuel from corn rather than oil. Unless consumer preferences cohere more consistently around the upstream characteristics of energy sources, or unless clean energy technologies offer some kind of a distinct end-use advantage, policy signals will necessarily provide a great deal of the guidance for future demands for energy and clean energy innovations. Now, past experience points to a third and final lesson for governments and for markets. Innovation accelerates where vibrant private sectors and competition flourish. In other industries, innovation has been supported by vigorous trade in goods, services, and ideas, by competition policies, by balanced protection of intellectual property, and through standard setting. For energy, there's reason to believe that the recipe for progress could be similar. These types of policy approaches should be our guide, or I hope at least a firm foundation upon which to build, by supporting innovation while recognizing the environmental and security challenges that are faced by the energy sector. We can advance multiple goals to growing the economy, a cleaner environment, and a secure energy system. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this conference, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
just go ahead.
Oh my goodness. Everything's lit up here. Yes, likewise. A great pleasure to be here this morning. Yes, thank you. I rather suspect that much of what I'm going to say really reflects back to what we were talking about in the first session, but I'm going to try to handle this thorny question that Peter really started to raise this morning of Canada's innovation system and whether it is responding to any of the kinds of needs that the other Richard has been pointing to here. And like Peter, I'm also going to take an historical approach to this because I think this is really, really important. We tend to think of our position now as having always been that way, and it hasn't always been that way. It is actually a lot of evolution, and indeed when the Lamontagne report came out with that negative comment, we were actually in the middle or the start of what arguably was a real flourishing in the productivity of our innovation system such as it was. So I guess what I'm going to try to argue today is that the problem really shouldn't be stated as how we are going to reorient some kind of existing system to this new goal of, let's say, we want to reorient what we're doing in innovation towards sustainability or clean technology outcomes, or however you want to put that. The real problem is a question of how we are going to rebuild, at least in Canada, a regime that is pretty much moribund. Now, Peter raised the point here that what are we complaining about? We are doing very, very, very well, or at least we have up to this point. So are we risking fixing something that doesn't need fixing? And I'm very concerned about that because there are lots of proposals. In this province, I think our Alberta innovation system has changed every 4 or 5 weeks. So nobody knows what's going on, okay? It's what I call the blue-ass fly theory of innovation. Sorry, but so you know, I think we need to reflect on exactly what it is we're doing here and whether we need to fix something and what it is that we can fix. And more importantly than that, I think there are these three really key questions. Well, sorry, what am I doing? These three really key questions here, which are, if we're going to ask government to do something, government's the policy instrument, what are we going to ask them to do? And the follow-on question to that is, what do we know about what they've done in the past that works and what doesn't? And actually, we know an awful lot about this. An awful lot about this. There are literally thousands of program evaluations and impact assessments out there, many of them done under the GPRA regime in the US, and I mean, John Alec was involved in this early on, and of course in the European Union, just hundreds and hundreds of them. About 1,000 of them have actually appeared in the peer-reviewed literature, so much of what I'm going to say is actually a kind of synthesis of what's out there. And you can consult these things. If you don't believe me, they're there. And then the last thing is, how must we adjust the regime here in Canada, or must we? Maybe that's the question, in order to accommodate this clean innovation agenda. But I think we have to start by actually asking ourselves a question, what are we talking about? We put a whole bunch of terms on the table already this morning that we think are concerned with innovation. But this is a little schematic I put together, and I presented it a number of places. People seem to find it useful, so I'll use it again. It's not perfect. It's two-dimensional, and really I'm talking about at least a three-dimensional thing, and my string theorist pals think I'm talking about a 5 or 6 dimensional thing. We recognize all these terms. We recognize entrepreneurship, diversification, but we don't necessarily recognize some of the other points. So most of what we're talking about so far this morning is about 2 of those things: getting new ideas, combining them through a process of entrepreneurship, applying them to something and putting them in the market, commercializing them. That's pretty much the extent of what we were talking about this morning. But there have been a few clues that it's deeper than that. People have been saying, well, wait a minute, it's not just about technology. Velma made that point. A number of other people have made, you'd made the point just now. It's not just about technology. Everything has to be coordinated in this process, even just if you're looking at those 2 applications. So what we're really concerned about in Canada at the moment with falling oil prices and dependency on fossil fuels is, how can we diversify? This is the big issue. Well, diversification isn't just about commercialization. It's about creating industries. You've got to take those ideas, those applications, and you've got to do something with them. You've got to end up with some kind of a structure that's going to produce value for you in the longer term. And a lot of people have mentioned standardization. This is an area I've written 100 papers on standardization in my lifetime, if I've written one. all innovations have to become standards. If they don't, nobody makes any money. This is why all the leaders in all the areas of technology eventually get together and they set codes, they set protocols, they set interconnection standards, they set all of these kinds of things. We wouldn't have the internet, we wouldn't have the smartphone, we wouldn't have any of the technologies, we wouldn't have any of the electricity grid, we wouldn't have any nuclear energy, we wouldn't have any of this if we didn't have standards. Controlling the standard is the mark of the maturity of an innovating firm or an innovating sector. Okay? But of course, once you standardize, you create a lot of dissension. You create an opportunity for disruption. New ideas come in and say, I don't like that anymore. You're incumbents and you're bad guys. And so I want to knock you out of the market and I want to come in and take your place. That's how you get this dynamicism constantly coming into the process. You've got to think of the system as being all of those things, and you've got to think about it as being a dynamic, not as being a set of cookie cutter institutions, which is the way we tend to embody this kind of thinking. Okay, this is not from me. This is just encapsulating a wide body of theory and evidence as to what innovation is. I don't think anybody who reads in that area would really be too surprised at what is in that little diagram. Okay, but let's look at Canada and what we've actually done. And here I'm drawing on the work of Jorge Nyosi at the University of Montreal over many years. He's been really a very good analyst of all of this. And one thing he noticed was that previous to about 1985, mid-80s are the watershed, really, aren't they? And previous to that period, most of what we were doing in Canada in terms of what we would now call innovation or developing new industries was really quite vertically oriented and very function oriented, kind of to that diagram I was just showing you. Whereas what we've done since 1985 has been very kind of horizontally oriented. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll show you in a minute. I'm very much focused on agency. Okay, a vertically oriented system. These are sector-based initiatives. They're very much problem-oriented. They're oriented to making stuff. There's a huge amount of public and private sector leverage of various kinds that goes into lots of public sector investment, linked up legislation. And I'm not going to go over all of these things, but I think we all recognize what these things are, and many of them have been talked about already. Now, when you get into this horizontally oriented system, this is what you kind of get. If you read the last two government statements on Canada's S&T system, it's basically just a litany of all these organizations you've never heard of before and will likely never hear of again. You don't really know what they do, and they each get $1 million or $2 million or $5 million, and there's no connection between them. And if you go to every jurisdiction in the OECD, you say the same cookie-cutter set of institutions purporting to do exactly the same things. For the most part, we don't even know what they do, let alone evaluate efficiently what it is they have done. And the difference is that this vertically oriented system was very much oriented to growing industries, making real industries, which Velma, you're talking about this morning, and absolutely on the money here. Whereas the system we have now, this kind of post-watershed where it's a bad idea to talk about industrial policy, is really oriented to growing individual firms, and particularly small firms. And I hate to dump on small firms. I don't dump on small firms. I think they're important. But so much is expected of small firms in this system, way more than they can possibly be expected to deliver. So what did we do under that vertically oriented system? It's really interesting what we did. We developed really leading positions, world-beating positions in many ways, in a lot of key industries. We developed our own aerospace industry using that paradigm. We invented nuclear power. We invented digital communications. Okay, we invented it, invented here. And the first digitally switched public network in the world was here in Canada. Not in the United States, here in Canada. All developed by this funny little company called Northern Electric, interestingly enough, okay? We developed a computing industry. We developed a biotechnology industry. We developed chemical industries. And the oil sands is probably the epitome of this approach. The absolute epitome of this approach. What have we done under the horizontally oriented approach? I'm really scratching my head to think of any major achievement, any ways comparable to those that has happened since 1985. And drawing on, I think both Peter and I tend to read the same things, but this is a really interesting paper that the Center for Studies in Living Standards brought out some years ago, in which they looked at the performance gap in terms of productivity between Canada and the United States, and they noticed that up previous to 1985 or so, all of the that gap was really narrowing to its narrowest point. And then after we started pursuing this different approach to innovation policy, it started going down. And also, if you look at the other indicators, the diversification indicators, such innovation indicators as we have, they don't extend as far back as I'm indicating here, actually. The trend line is the same. They all trend upwards towards the mid-'80s, and they've all been disastrously trending down since the mid-1980s. There have been all kinds of factors, as many people have noted, that have mitigated that. Okay? We have continued to prosper regardless of this downturn. The real question is, can we continue, or do we want to take the bet that we're going to continue to prosper? Because a lot of the things that we have depended upon from the United States, the symbiosis, no longer apply. The US is no longer a world leader in many areas of technology, whether it's clean or otherwise. That's been diminishing over the years. So how much can we depend on this relationship solely with the United States? Okay. The one positive thing, I suppose, that our current government has done is it signed 50 or so free trade agreements with countries around the world, but has never considered what the hell we're going to put into the pipeline. If we are going to import, high-value technology from Germany and Italy, for God's sake, and then what do we export to them? Pigs? Somebody's not thinking about the whole pipeline here. They're just thinking about doing stuff. So what do governments do that we can actually evaluate? Now, these are just some of the things that they do, and I won't go over them all, except to say that I have arrayed them with malice aforethought. There is a reasoning behind my putting these things together that way. And the reason is because, they do different things. Some of them are very structural. In other words, every time you look at a positive innovation outcome, you are going to see some of those kinds of actions by government being implicit in that. Some of them are very targeted. They work some of the time in some circumstances, but they don't come into play all of the time. And the other ones, and the really interesting ones, are ones I call transposable actions, which means that they can work in a whole bunch of different areas, and it depends how you orient them, depends what you want to do with them, how they actually work. And so this is why, if you read the literature these days on innovation policy, everybody stresses this concept of a policy mix. You've got to have really all of that stuff ready in your bag in order to go, because you're going to need a different configuration of all of those things depending on where you are in time, and where you are with respect to the market, and where you are with respect to everything else that might implode on this. So the worst thing you could have is a policy monoculture. And in Canada we have, I would say, a policy uniculture. We lower taxes. Well, that's the economic policy of the government for the last 10 years. Taxes. Lower them and everything will happen. Everything will be fine. Okay? But it isn't fine, and nothing's happened. So the interesting thing is, if you look at the evidence, and as I say, there's an interesting compendium that the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts has compiled in the UK, in which they've gone over actually 800 or 900 of these evaluations that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature. You can download it for free. It's interesting. A long read, but it's interesting. And they've actually looked at all of these evaluations and tried to figure out which policies, on balance, have the highest degree of additionality, and which positive outcomes can be attributed directly to those actions, as opposed to them being just noise in the system. And interestingly enough, and we can quibble about a few of these perhaps, but interestingly enough, it's these really kind of basic things that government does. Rulemaking, that can include setting a carbon price, okay? Education and skills, basic research. We talked about procurement, direct action, direct subsidies, not indirect subsidies. All these things have been shown, not always, not in every situation, but on balance, to have played a very positive role in this process. Whereas when you get to the bottom part here, government action is just noise in the system very often. Yeah, it could have played a role, but all kinds of other things are playing a role too. You're dealing in the market down there. Now, the big problem is that if you look at where the political capital is invested, it's exactly reversed. Governments tend to see, do I have a pointer here? No. Tend to see the top part of this as being a feeder into the bottom part of this, and they don't see how the system is actually interacting. So this is a real problem, I think, when we're trying to strategize here. This fits in extremely well by the way, with what we now know about the way knowledge transfer or technology transfer, if you want to call it, or knowledge translation actually works. I mean, part of the problem with the way this has been done for maybe 40 years is we've looked mainly at the institutions that are purpose-built for taking knowledge from universities, say, and putting it into the market. So most of our studies only look at that. This is such a minor part of what goes on in terms of knowledge translation that it really doesn't tell you anything, and people have acknowledged this for years. So a lot of studies have come up within the past few years. I've just illustrated a few of them. I can point you to any of these specifically if you like, that have indicated that actually the highest coefficient of translation into actual innovation in the market doesn't come from equity patenting arrangements with universities. It doesn't come from startups or joint ventures. These things can play a role. They can be significant. Okay, I'm not trying to say never do them. They mostly come from open science and access to people who can interpret it for you, and contractual work with academics and universities, consulting work, all of this kind of thing. So most companies don't come to universities looking for ideas to commercialize. They come looking for what's above the ear line. And can you solve my problem for me? I have no idea how to solve this problem. Can it be solved? Is there a solution already? Guide me. Lead me. And these we know from these studies that many of these relationships are exceptionally long-term. They go over 20, 30 years sometime. The biggest study of its kind ever done, and this is I've stolen this from Nature because it was profiled in Nature a few years ago. A group from Imperial College did this. Look at this. I mean, the purple line there, these are the entrepreneurial activities in American universities, and they surveyed, I think, 16,000, 17,000 academics. These are companies that are started up on campus to commercialize knowledge in some way, and the amount that actually uses an IP-based model for that transfer is actually a minority, and particularly if you look at the social sciences area, and there's additional literature on that, which actually indicates that knowledge transfer from the social sciences, unlike the technical knowledge, goes straight in to the highest decision-making parts of the firm. So it's actually more significant form of transfer than the technology part of it. Okay? So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. If we put those together, those top three things are really the kind of structural things. You're going to see them everywhere. Everybody does it. Everybody has to do it. It doesn't give you any particular advantage. You can increase your investment there remarkably, and the rest of the system won't necessarily respond. It could, but it won't necessarily respond. Likewise, on the bottom, you've got all these very targeted things, which is what governments like to focus on. But very often their actions can be noise in the market. So yeah, does a tax incentive scheme work? Sure, some of the time, in some cases, yeah. Is it the blanket policy that the only policy you should have, as the Jenkins report pointed out a few years ago? Absolutely not. That's just stupid. That's silly to do things like that. But the really interesting ones are these, and I've only illustrated maybe 4 of them, but these transposable things. This is where every country can gain a strategic advantage because you can shape these things in different ways. So Peter and a number of others have mentioned procurement. That's one way you can do it. The way you coordinate, the way you network. Last night at dinner we were talking about information and knowledge and intelligence, and the vital role of government in providing that in some kind of impartial way, and how that's been completely disemboweled in Canada over the last 10 years, really. Okay? So those are things that we can really do where we can engineer advantages for ourselves, real strategic advantages. So if we look at my original little diagram here, what are we doing now in Canada? We're mostly focused on strictly technology-based policy, doing more R&D, encouraging more R&D to be done, okay? And we're only looking at those fairly minor functions, actually, in terms of creating value. That's all we're doing. And this is unnatural territory for policy. These are all these targeted initiatives that are very noisy. Whereas if we look at where government really usually inhabits in terms of policy, the kinds of basic governance that government delivers, this is also relevant to a great many areas in this diagram. This is where you get into consumer affairs, so your demand problem. This is where you get into regulating safety. This is where you get into setting the standards. This is where your building codes come from, which are so important. Your electrical codes come from. All of the basic governance functions. Now, if you're going to put an electrical code in place that is not going to allow me to come up with one of these great solutions that Richard was talking about, that's a bad thing. But if you're going to orient it such that you are going to allow me to play in that space and experiment, that's a good thing. And that can have a hell of a bigger effect than supporting 100 or 1,000 startups with neat ideas, but no market to sell them into. Okay, because of the problem there. And then, of course, we've got this bugbear. We keep talking about industrial policy. Nobody wants to use this word anymore because they think it's about socialism and public ownership. It was never about that. My graduate student, Elise, who's sitting over there, has been very good to put us in touch with people in Israel where she's doing a study of the Israeli system. And we're talking to Gil Fortuna, who is one of the architects of the Israeli startup nation thing. And now he's saying, we're not doing that anymore. That's not the focus of our system, because we didn't get any value out of that. We just got good at commercializing technology. We got very good at it. We got to be the best in the world. We don't see the bottom line. We need to develop industries. So now actually they're focusing on what we would call industrial policy, except I asked Gilly whether this was a problematic term in Israel, and he says, absolutely, I cannot use that term. So I call it industrial excellence, and the problem goes away. And I think we need to take a page out of Gilly's book here. We're trying to get Gilly to come here actually to talk to us here in Alberta about these kinds of things. So where are we now in terms of this, I think, looming crisis? Because I don't think things are as they were. We've ridden we haven't ridden on coattails. We've had a productive symbiotic relationship with our neighbor to the south for a very long time. That's breaking down for a whole lot of reasons, and we do have to think about moving forward. So are we equipped? So what do we see? It isn't very good. As Peter pointed out, all of our indicators in the diversification innovation space are negative, and worse than that, the trend lines are downwards, and there is no indication that they're going to go upwards. Okay? Now, you can argue a whole lot of different reasons for that. You can argue about the methodologies and the definite. It's just a negative thing. Okay, and you don't score that negatively for 30 years without there being a problem. We've got a policy monoculture. No positive thinking in this area for a very long time. Our conceptual apparatus and our institutional apparatus is, we were talking at the table, knuckle dragging? No, I'm thinking that knuckle dragging is an affront to the chimpanzees and the gorillas of the world. It's really, really, we've got to think seriously about this. Yes, this culture of ignorance and the suppression of evidence, this war on science that we're dealing with here. What does that say to us, let alone to the world? And I think, Nick, you were telling me that Canada is now one of the 3 worst countries in the OECD for access to data? Okay. Sorry. It wasn't Nick at all. I made that up. But it is a problem. We've just got access to our own research group to some Statistics Canada data, which I could download for free in Europe from the internet. It's taken us 4 years, okay, to get access to this data. So we haven't got any government thinking, 0 priority at the moment. More in the provinces. Provinces are really interesting because the provinces, we were talking last night how at least 4 of the provinces with 85% of the population are getting their act together and just pretending there isn't a federal government, because in practice there really isn't one. And they're starting to try to figure out how they can solve these problems multilaterally. So that may be a real opportunity. And in the middle of all of this, we have just an enormous amount of high-class ingenuity here in this country either going to waste completely because they can't get started, or worse, we're just selling it off like an agricultural crop. And we need to get away from that. So even if we only get 1% of this clean energy market or clean innovation market, that's big for us, okay? We can dominate certain parts of that market, and the fact that we're not thinking about how we can exploit that, I think, is a real problem. So where do we need to be? Anywhere but where we are. We need to start moving somewhere. We need to start thinking about this. We need to start developing data and information sources, and we need to develop analytical capabilities. We need to learn where we are and where we can go. And I think this idea of clean innovation, why not make this our moonshot? You know, I think this is a really key thing. Why don't we just simply propose that as being the project for the nation? Something that we can organize ourselves around the way, say, in the 1980s, we organized our way around communications and digital technologies and these sorts of things. I don't see any reason why that's a bad idea. So leave you with that. Thanks for your attention. Welcome questions.
Great. Well, I too would like to thank Stuart and the organizers and the sponsors. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I feel like the odd man out with these two sages next to me in the panel. So hopefully some of what I say resonates with what you've heard already, and I might be able to add a few additional points. The first thing I'd like to say is that so I'm the OECD, the medicine man, Peter's medicine man, and the medicine hasn't worked very well. And I think that doesn't surprise me insofar as we've moved a long way in the last 2 decades in terms of our notions of what induces innovation and what can change the direction of innovation. And to a certain extent, the OECD, like everywhere else, is a slow-moving boat, and when you tie 34 boats together, it's increasingly slow-moving. To that end, we will now be reducing a new innovation strategy, something called Innovation Strategy 2015, which once the various member countries have torn it to shreds, should be available. And hopefully it gives a broader view as to how countries might induce innovation and some of the basic policy principles that are worth bearing in mind. And I think my talk will be quite narrow relative to some of the other talks that have been described. Narrow in a few senses. First of all, it's narrow in the sense that I'm really focusing on technology. I'm focusing on technology because that's my area of expertise, but where appropriate, I'll try to bring in non-technological innovation because I do think it's fundamentally important for innovation in general, but for environmental innovation as well. I'll go through sort of the data graphs very quickly because I think that it's difficult to, hopefully these will be made available and people can then look at the references and have some idea. The one point I'd like to say here is that at least as it's reflected in patent data, the rate of innovation for what could be said to be clean tech is increasing more quickly than in patents more generally. That's not surprising. Most of them are less mature, right? There are some areas which are exceptions. I'll be very brief with respect to this. And in this case, it includes water pollution, waste management, and land remediation. I want to say one thing about that. That will change and is changing already in the data. Why is that? And it comes to a point that I'll make very soon, is that it's very difficult to define environmental innovation. It's particularly difficult to define environmental innovation when you have to look at classifications, whether they be commodities, sectors, or patents in this case. Those are index numbers. Exactly, those are index numbers. But in the case of something like land remediation, we've had examples of this mentioned already today, wastewater management and water pollution. There are huge benefits coming from the bio and the nano areas, which are actually giving a second wind to innovation in these domains. And so actually what you see is not sort of these usual Gompertz curves that you see in the past, you see waves now of innovations within specific areas. And that's to do with converging technologies in different domains, which I think is a very important development in the last little while. Where does Canada sit? Just a few things. So if we look at nano and bio, ICT, and environment-related technologies, as we've defined them, actually Canada does very well. Does very well relative to the OECD median, European Union, and okay relative to the United States. But I want to be clear that this is revealed. So this is based on, it's all normalized on the basis of their general rates of innovation. The important point to bear in mind is actually, at least as reflected in patent data, the rate of innovation in Canada is quite low, right? But it is specialized in areas which are fast emerging. And that's quite important to bear in mind. So what are some principles? How do you get the innovation that you want to get? And now I'm focusing strictly on environmental policy design. We think there are sort of 5 basic principles, okay? This is based on a paper that came out a little while. I always thought it would take off. I keep on hoping it will take off, but some innovations never take off. First of all, stringency. How big is the cost of not innovating, right? That's self-evident. Flexibility. As I always say, I'm a bureaucrat. I come from a long line of bureaucrats. We know nothing. What do we know? We know that business knows a great deal. So what we want to do is induce search. And flexible policies induce search. They also allow for people to adopt those technologies which are most appropriate for their needs. So you need to be flexible. Thirdly, and reference has been made to this, it needs to be predictable. It doesn't need to be constant and certain. It needs to be predictable. So that on the basis of new information that is available to both the government and businesses, one can imagine the likely direction that policy will take. Because businesses have to deal with uncertainty all the time. So you don't want to wipe away the uncertainty, but you want to make the nature of the policy regime predictable. I think that's fundamentally important. And then incidents. This is something about which I feel very strongly, because when we talk about climate change, we talk often about carbon. Carbon is the easiest environmental problem to regulate, right? Everything else, we're regulating a proxy for what we really want to get at, almost without exception. And that's important, because then we innovate to that proxy. And as time passes, you deviate further and further from what your ultimate policy objective is. And I think that's fundamentally important, and we need to bear that in mind. Depth, I won't go into. It always raises confusion. Effectively, going backwards, effectively, it just means that you're providing incentives to innovate across the entire spectrum of possible outcomes, right down to zero emissions, right? Think of a performance-based standard, gives you no incentive to go down to zero emissions, right? That's different from stringency. You have depth at any level of stringency, okay? Hope that wasn't too confusing. So actually, on that basis, what do we see? We see that market-based instruments, and particularly the point made by Richard and others, are frequently taxes and tradable permit systems. They hit most of these buttons, or they can hit most of these buttons. That's not to say that other policies don't hit many of these buttons, but in general, the correlation between these kinds of instruments that we're discussing as being essential for inducing innovation do well when we look at them in terms of those criteria. But of course, we've got another big failure, not just the environmental policy one, we've got this whole knowledge market failure. That's why we're here, it's for innovation. And information knowledge is a public good or has public good elements. So it's nice to have the right incentives to encourage you to substitute between using A and B, but you also need a general framework, which means that irrespective of whether it's A or B, the rate of innovation is increasing. And that, of course, is what our general framework policies for innovation are all about. Aligns very closely with Richard's list of the top policies for which you're most likely to get the most impact. So protection of IP and investment in higher education. I didn't know the protection of IP was such an issue in Canada, or rather the use of IP was such an important issue in Canada, at least insofar as it relates to clean tech. That's interesting. And of course, skills as a corollary to investment in higher education. Investment in basic research, of course, because that's where the failures, the knowledge failures, are most important, right? Where the public good elements are most important. So it's a fundamental groundwork, core policy as we go further. Well-designed support policies for applied business R&D. When I say well-designed, if we've done anything in the OECD of use in the last little while, we've started to get into the devil in the details related to different kinds of support policies. It's not a question of grants versus R&D tax incentives, because we design them all in completely different ways. So we need to look at how we provide support and the implications of providing that support that actually has on outcomes. And then, of course, encouraging collaboration across different actors in the market and the government, and open innovation. Open innovation, because of ICT and so many other things, we don't yet know how to deal with all of the knowledge flows that we are facing and how to encourage those knowledge flows in a way which further encourages future generation of knowledge. It's a big issue, right? And it links closely with the protection of intellectual property. Our intellectual property rights regimes are not well suited always to deal with all of the challenges raised by open innovation. Actually, at a more mundane level, or not mundane, more important level, I think the example of COSIA that we had this morning is a very interesting area, and where you see this kind of collaboration and open innovation and the role that it can play, which wouldn't have existed 15, 20 years ago. Just a few brief graphs here. Basic research. Basic research is falling, actually. This is indexed again. Everything's indexed to make life easy. surprised to hear that basic research is increasing in Canada. It's decreasing in most parts, or at least as a proportion of R&D expenditures across most of the OECD countries. Actually, the data on basic versus applied research in Canada is more difficult to make comparable with those in other countries. So frequently in our graphs, as you'll see right here, we're not able to provide an observation for basic research for Canada relative to other countries because there are problems in definitions, which we have not been able to make commensurable with some other OECD countries. So just a few small points, and then I'll get to the heart of the matter. What do you see here? You see that there's actually more innovation, let's call it thematic rather than generic. So actually we target a bit more in North America than the OECD median, right? Which is slightly surprising given the next graph that I'll show to you. What else do you see here that is perhaps interesting? Comparing the United States and Canada when it comes to things like thematic is also a bit issue because thematic in the US, defense plays such a big role that it really is a bit of an outlier. I mean, if you put Israel up there, you'd see it far off to the right. But as I said, I'll make these graphs available to you and I'll just continue on. This, I think, is a very important point. In Canada, there is a much greater use of indirect public support for business R&D, tax incentives. So if you've been following the medicine, you've been following it too well. Because actually we asked for a shift away from direct support towards R&D tax incentives, and Canada has really gone in a significant way towards the indirect support measures, which have their advantages and disadvantages. And some of the most important disadvantages relate to their treatment of different kinds of firms. I didn't have that graph, so I'll just say it. Yes, I do have it later on. I'll come back to that. So a general framework, core policies. You want basic support for your innovation knowledge market failure. You want generic policies insofar as they relate to the environmental bad. But that clearly is not enough, and that's what you would have heard 20 years ago from the OECD, right? You've got two different failures, use two different instruments, leave it at that, go on with it. Actually, the world is opening up a bit, and it's opening up a bit in terms of the nature of the tools that we think are most appropriate, that based on the evidence we see, governments should think about applying. And why is that? Now, I'll just say one point about all of these bullets here, is that I think that the markets in which carbon and clean, more generally, environmental technologies are most important are also those markets which are furthest from our textbook characterizations of markets, right? So we don't just have the environmental market failure and the knowledge market failure. We're already active in all of these sectors as regulators anyway, right? Building and land use, transport, electricity. In all of those areas, we're setting the framework for the market. Now that, of course, raises issues of policy alignment, a point that Stuart has referred to in many points. We have a new paper, a new report coming out on that. But what I think it means is that whether we like it or not, we are affecting the extent to which there will be innovation in environmental technologies with or without everything that I said before. Because we're intervening in these markets in significant ways all the time and setting the framework for those markets in many ways. So now let's say just 4 quick points about things where it gets really sticky, okay? Beyond direct environmental. So I spent, I don't know how many years with my colleagues trying to figure out what an environmental technology was. Drove me bananas. But I think that we made progress. We didn't actually make progress when we started working seriously with chemists and engineers and others who helped guide us. But the main point that we see is that if we compare what as our definition of environment-related technologies, and we look at the sources of scientific scientific knowledge that were cited by these technologies, we see it can come from anywhere, right? So to say there is an environmental technology, which I say all the time, is out there, is a misnomer. Because the things that can generate environmental benefits are frequently not labeled environmental. And those which may be important but least interesting, a scrubber, CCS, which is profoundly important, don't get me wrong, and arose from other fields of science, had nothing to do with environmental, are those which potentially are least interesting in terms of emerging technologies that might really change the way that we, our impacts on climate and the environment. I'll give one example. So we developed a strategy that relates to looking for information and communication technologies with implications for energy management. Distributed grids, smart meters. Smart meters are a small part of it, everything. And how those coexist with everything related to energy management. And what we see, in fact, is that it is increasing. It is increasing at a rate, so it's YO4S, apologies, I don't know how to use these little thingies. YO4S is increasing faster than CCS patents, for that matter, but also to a certain extent, at a pace that is equal to renewables. So all the money that we've thrown at renewable energy, we're getting a rate of innovation which is, very high, but actually what could be more determinant is something like ICT for the points that were raised, the security of the grid. The need to allow for the penetration of renewables inside the grid is dependent upon the application of better quality ICT and grid management more generally. But actually, we're investing relatively little in that if you compare it to wind and solar, right? So in a way, we got the cart before the horse. We invested a huge amount of money in generating technologies, which then faced a grid which couldn't accommodate them at a certain point in time. And we said, my God, what do we do now? And now we're in a situation where we're going to have to rethink the grid and start investing in innovation which allow for the accommodation of these renewables. That actually is the situation that Europe faces now. It's like 15 wasted years. I'm exaggerating. It's a webcast. We'll excise that bit. So what do we end up with? Small study, don't worry about it. Let's just say that difference is 20%. Normal scenarios as to investment in the grid, what would you see if you had a relatively slow rate or a relatively high rate? 20% difference in the capacity required to meet a given level of penetration. 20% difference in a very short period of time. That is a lot of concrete and a lot of fields full of solar panels that aren't actually getting into the grid, right? Beyond incremental, I think this is key. We need a basket of incentives which deal with incremental and allow for the possibility of breakthrough. And we need to make sure that they don't crowd each other out. And actually, there's some nice papers now on how to make sure that they don't crowd each other out, that a focus on one doesn't crowd out the other, and vice versa. I think actually there's a psychological danger as we start thinking about geoengineering and CCS in the grand scheme, that we might crowd out the short-run incentives, or incentives for short-run incremental innovation, right? So there's danger of temporal crowding out, which requires the balance, I think, of supply-side measures, which lower the cost of innovation, and demand-side measures. Now, to say demand-side measures when it comes to environmental innovation, 10 years ago, you just couldn't get away with that. Let's take procurement. Why should I be asking taxpayers something to do which I'm not, as a regulator, willing to force consumers to do, right? Then I think you need to think of the potential innovation benefits of it. It's not just the size of the public sector as a buyer. You have to focus it on areas where there are other market failures that can be overcome through procurement. So that's demonstration issues, it's network externalities, it's all of those things. And I think then we can make a very intelligent procurement policy oriented towards innovation in the environmental domain, but we need to identify what it is about the market for which that is the right instrument to use. So with or without breakthrough innovations, I'll skip that. It's just to give some indication of what the implications would be if we just focused on incremental innovation relative to ultimately inducing breakthrough innovations, and I have to say, based on zero empirical evidence. It's a general equilibrium model, so that means based on zero equilibrium. That's one point. But the second point is what we do is we run these models, then suddenly manna falls from heaven. It's called a breakthrough innovation. And it has at a point in time, at a price, and then it throws out everything else we've ever done. And that just gives an idea of the magnitude difference you get when you have assumptions about bringing in different breakthrough technologies at different points in time. So the point is we need to think a little bit more about what breakthrough innovations are and if there is anything we can do about them beyond general support for the innovation process. We've done some very preliminary work in this area, and I won't spend much time on it, but actually what it's just trying to do is look at the attributes of innovations, which ultimately then early indicators of the attributes of innovations, which then went through the roof, right? And try and identify whether or not there's any sort of empirical regularity with respect to these and how they might relate to clean innovation. I'll leave that with you later on, but it just gives some idea. So you have, I'll go back and just say what they mean. Originality. I won't say that. 2 minutes. Last point, beyond incumbents. I think we need to think seriously about entry. More importantly, I think we need to think about entry and post-entry growth, right? We need to think about what happens after a firm enters, what allows it to scale up, and what encourages exit, optimal exit, right? If I see anything across general rate and declining startup rates across all OECD economies with some marginal exceptions, this is a painstaking effort to get commensurable data across all these countries. With most few exceptions, you don't see, you see them falling. But what you do see is huge differences in the size of firms which survive, right? From 2 years, 0 to 2 years, to 10 years. Now, Canada doesn't do that badly, right? Canada actually has a reasonably high rate of post-entry growth. A relatively low survival rate, right? Which means actually exit. That's not a bad thing, right? Exit and entry need to coexist. Without the coexistence of entry and exit, you end up with what is, well, Italians in the room, my apologies, but I'm allowed to say this, a large number of very small firms which are not productive at all because they're given no incentive to leave the market, and thus resources are trapped inside firms which would be better deployed elsewhere. So it's one thing to push out the frontier. It's another thing to encourage those who are lagging to either exit the market. Failure is not a bad thing. Those successful economies are ones which tolerate failure and allow the entrepreneurs then to seek other opportunities. And there's very good evidence which shows that very few successful entrepreneurs are successful the first time. Very few. And actually failure is a welcome vaccine, a welcome antidote in order to then become successful. Small point here. What we do see, which is very disconcerting, the whole point was made about diffusion, is that the most productive global frontier firms are pulling away from other firms. There's a divergence. And we need to think about why that divergence arises and what kinds of policies, and I've outlined some of them, will allow then the laggards to catch up, or for the resources that are presently in laggards to find better, more productive uses elsewhere in the economy. Wrap up. Please look at the slides if you're at all interested, because there's some other bits in there that might be useful. There's been a technology focus to the presentation. I apologize for that. There are managerial, organizational, institutional innovations which are complements. Where do we see that most? ICT. Everybody spent their time looking where are the productivity of benefits of ICT. They didn't see that, actually, until they married ICT with organizational capital. It's the complementarity between organizational capital, managerial quality, and ICT which gives you the productivity benefits. If you just look at ICT on its own, we're still not seeing the huge productivity benefits we'd like to see. So, small point. Generic policies. The bedrock of policy has to be bedrock core environmental and innovation policies, which are generally quite generic in nature. They're not picking winners. But it needs to be supported, I think, by more discretionary support. I've given some examples of the kind of discretionary support I think are useful, but what we haven't discussed is, I think, the whole question of how to know what to do that in terms of the policy process. First of all, clarity and objectives. Why did I provide that support? You'd be amazed how many times it's not obvious to the policymakers themselves what the objective of that was. Evaluate, preferably ex ante and ex post, and link with the policy cycle. If you get a bad evaluation, what do you do? Ensure that the public bears risk, which is proportionate, simple moral hazard question. But most importantly, plan for exit. and make that plan known to avoid governments having to spend their time fending off those who are getting the rents, which of course is a huge problem. Guiding principle, ensure the policy does not implicitly or explicitly flavor encompass, keep the unborn in mind, the unborn who don't have a voice. And ensure access to the frontier. I think here research mobility and international cooperation is extremely important. Final point, Canadian international cooperation in environment-related technologies is extremely high. Extremely high relative to cooperation in other domains, and extremely high relative to, and it's not all with the United States, actually. So I'll conclude there before I get shot.
Okay. I don't know about you, I found that was fascinating, three fantastic talks, and I have a self-interest in keeping my own comments here short, not only because we're running a bit behind through no fault of the speakers, it's just through the schedule today, and because part of my job following this discussion, working with a number of other people here, will be to synthesize what they've been telling us with what I'm hoping you're going to comment on afterwards, and I'd much rather hear what you're going to have to say than my own summary at this point. But perhaps just shooting myself in the foot a little bit before we get there, I will offer one idea or comment up. And it's that, so starting back from the morning, Peter Nicholson ended his talk by referencing the idea that we need to disrupt the low innovation equilibrium in Canada. And one way we need to do that is look for small catastrophes. But the example he gave was actually a policy choice. It was a regulation in the US that made it imperative for Nortel to look for innovations to remain competitive. And that was a lot of what Richard Newell's talk had to do a lot with, was creating an imperative to look for the type of environmental innovations or clean innovations that we need to look for. And we can do that through demand policy, creating demand, so things like a carbon price or standards. We can also do that by creating imperative to meet a market demand, so increased competition and increased opportunity for returns to investments. So this is a key point, and it's unique to the clean innovation discussion, or it's specific to the clean innovation discussion, is that you really need strong policy to create that imperative to move forward from. And then the rest of, Richard Hawkins' talk and Nick Johnstone's talk were very much more about, once we have that imperative, well, what policies, or towards that imperative, and then also more generally to incentivize innovation, what type of policies can we look at? What is the evidence for which policies work, which is a really important question. And it's going to be an important question within the Canadian context that we saw earlier this morning. And then what range of policies within that evidence can we consider? And so there's structural policies, such as basic research support, that we're going to want to look at. But then what Richard Hawkins called I'm going to forget the term, the transposable policies, where we seem to have there's more of a range of decisions that need to be made in terms of where they're going to be targeted and what the policy mix is going to be. And I'm not going to comment too much on the specific ones raised. I don't think I could do that justice versus what they showed you. But just one question that sticks in my mind after that might feed into the conversation a little bit here and a little bit over lunch in the afternoon is, do the range of policies that they presented and the challenges that each of those sort of entail, do we have the institutional structure to deal with the questions that are raised? So if we have to think about procurement, which is decisions made by government on specific areas where we're going to target. Well, we're also thinking about the type of infrastructure policy that Nick raises, where we need to support the grid at the same time as supporting renewable energy infrastructure. So that might be a longer-term investment that's going to involve maintenance over time as well. In addition to the type of shorter-term transitional policies we talked about this morning with Velma's presentation, 2 to 5 years, how do those fit in within the policy cycle when we're also trying to consider much longer-term investments? And do we really have the range of institutions that can deal with all of these choices or compete with each other in making the choices to maybe give us a wider range of better options to look at? So I'll leave my comments there, and hopefully we can have a good discussion following on before lunch. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to all three of our speakers. I'd like to seed a question if I can, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. Richard Newell, you talked about your three key ingredients for innovation. We had Richard Hawkins. I really walked away with the point, your right policy mix and the highest additionality versus lowest additionality levers, including the inverse being true around political capital. But Nick, while you're walking us through the evidence, the data and analysis that you've been able to bring to us from the OECD, you talked to us about, how can we successfully marry those long-term and short-term considerations, and that it is possible. So I'd like to ask a question that gets to that long-term and short-term issue. To wrap it up, Jeff, talked about it, you referenced it as well. What is an appropriate level of ambition for Canada when it comes to clean innovation? We can just adopt technologies if we want that meet short-term environmental, social, and economic considerations. Or, Richard Hawkins, to get to your point, do we want to actually make it that multi-decade moonshot level of ambition for Canada, as you suggested that we should or we could? Love to hear your thoughts on that level of ambition. Not all at once.
Can I go in?
Yeah.
People have mentioned a number of things in this regard, like prizes and other sorts of things. I just recall Dick Taylor, one of Canada's most distinguished scientists. He was born around here. He's a Nobel Prize winner in physics and professor at Stanford. He used to come up here quite often to work on the advisory boards for the Alberta Innovate system, and I got to know him a bit then. And he made this interesting comment. He said, you people you overthink this. There's a simple thing here. The trouble with Canadian kids is they want to grow up to be millionaires. The trouble with American kids is they want to grow up to be billionaires. Most of them are never going to achieve that goal. So on that level, they're equal. But it does matter the level at which you peg your goal, where you might get on the continuum between something and nothing. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement, and I hope I'm not misquoting or taking Dick's words in vain here. But I think we have under expectations for ourselves, and I think that is a problem. A lot of American friends say, I don't know how you feel about this, Americans maybe have over expectations of themselves. I don't know, but I think we do need to recalibrate. Let's put it this way. Whether we need a specific tool or instrument to do that, I don't know. But I'd be prepared to pull up the engineers that I teach over here every week. I'd be prepared to take those kids and put them up against the best in the world. They're fine. We don't have a problem. We don't have a cultural problem in Canada. Those kids are as smart, as motivated, as capable as you're going to find anywhere in the world. The difference is what system they're going to move into, and are we losing those kids from our I hate to call them kids, but I'm just getting old. Are we losing them because they're seeing the kind of ambition they aspire to in another location from us, and maybe in a province like this, they see lots of ambition, but it's maybe too narrowly focused. I really take on board what Nick said about the wave motion of this and how the things are interconnected, and how sometimes we think too much about trying to achieve something specific to one area, and we forget about the fact that the knowledge base is distributed through the whole economy in many cases, and we don't actually, it's very difficult to predict what's going to be the operational factor at any particular time. So I think it's difficult to just set prizes out there, but I think it's not difficult for us to set a standard that's higher than the one we set now as to how we think about these things.
I'll offer one comment, which is, and I concur, it is important to set ambitious goals. The moonshot, though, the Apollo project and the Manhattan project have, I think, often, though, incorrectly been attached to the energy problem for the following reasons. In those cases, the government was the provider and the researcher. The government was the customer. There was literally one of them that was built, and cost was not an object. And so there's a number of dimensions on which we need to be very careful with those analogies. So if one's goals are in terms of reducing emissions and they're set in an ambitious way, I would concur. I think cost, though, is also incredibly important, because all of these technologies are in competition with other technologies that provide reliable, cheap energy.
Great, Nick.
I don't have anything to add, just to say that I actually heard moonshine, and maybe that was...
That's at lunch.
That's U.S. biofuels policy.
No, I actually agree with what Richard was saying, but I think there's somewhere in between. I mean, I do think that the notion of having an objective which is clear and transparent in order to focus efforts is analogous with the moonshot. But the devil is in the details, I think, as Richard has so eloquently just stated.
So, I mean, say, I actually agree with what Richard said. You are agreeing with both the Richards.
No, I'm agreeing with both Richards.
Okay, great.
Because I think that's probably what Richard had in mind, or not.
Okay, happy to open it up to the floor. We've got, let's see here, 18 minutes for questions. I'm a little old-fashioned. I ask, when you ask a question, could you please identify yourself? Yep, support.
Thank you. My name's Sapor Berman, and my question is for you, Richard. Sorry.
Which Richard? Support?
Richard Newell. I've noted, I've read a lot of your work in the past on demand scenarios, and you talked about that in your presentation. I've noted in Canada in the last year that there is a link between innovation and the willingness to move on policy and demand scenarios. And it seems to me when I look into it more and more that demand growth scenarios for oil have been consistently soft, and that there is that what's happening in China right now with the deceleration is significant. And I'm surprised that both the US scenarios, the IEA scenarios seem to be backcasting, and that I haven't found a lot of scenarios that do forecasting that look at disruptive technologies, electric cars, fuel efficiency, and other than maybe some of the Citibank analysis. And I'm wondering if you have, and what you're seeing on demand scenarios on oil.
Yeah, good question. And so as I take the question is, where do various folks see the future for energy demand and oil demand specifically going in the future? Actually, projections for oil demand have come down, relative, still growth, but come down significantly from where they were a few years ago. Certainly as I alluded to, in the US and other OECD countries, oil demand is basically flat or declining, but in China, the Middle East, other fast-growing Asian economies, it continues to rise. Question is not whether it will rise, its question is how much. Built into scenarios which show, still continued oil demand growth, there's very, very substantial efficiency improvements built into those scenarios already. So these are not, they're often called business as usual. They're not really business as usual. They show very substantial efficiency improvements, a level of car ownership in China that never gets anywhere close to the United States. And so I think oil demand is going to continue to grow, not as fast as we had thought. So if you look at global scenarios, the International Energy Agency does something called a 450 scenario, which is a scenario which would target a 450 parts per million. So that's by far of the major international scenarios the most dramatic one. Under that scenario, global energy demand still grows 20% over the next 25 years, and in 2040, fossil fuels are still 40% of the global energy mix, just to kind of put it in perspective. So there is quite a wide range, but kind of a 30 to 50% increase in energy demand growth, I think, already incorporates in it some significant efficiency improvements already. So the challenge is high. Doesn't mean there won't be breakthroughs, but those scenarios already include significant progress.
Great. Let's go to the floor for another question. Prit.
Hi, Prit Kotecha. I noted my notes, and I'm not sure who made the comment, but it might have been Richard or Nick. Richard Hawkins. Around the fact that in the clean tech space, so in the development of clean technologies, which we said we don't really know how to define, there's this interesting discussion that policymakers and regulators are already playing in that market through setting of regulations. And implicitly, that's actually setting in the demand for clean technology. I thought that was really interesting. It wasn't in one of your slides. It was just a comment that you made. So I guess then, could you give examples of where, I guess more stringent policies have then gone and further increased development in clean technologies? Like, just give some examples of where that's worked well and where it hasn't.
I think that was targeted at me, but the question, sorry, I think I missed the question. It's where stringent policies have actually been successful in inducing innovation? When I say stringent, I mean ambitious, right? And so, the sticks that we have are, at least in the climate area, not that great in number and have been relatively modest. But we see it a lot on the carrot side, of course. The innovation, for better or for worse, that came out through the application of feed-in tariff systems in Europe has been remarkable. And the fact that they were then penetrated the market, allowed for demonstration and then learning, has driven down costs very quickly. But that happened, of course, in a relatively uncoordinated way, and so to a certain extent, it was Denmark's gift to the world. Very much appreciated, and I think that raises the question of international collaboration, because we're not going to see many cases like that. So there's no question in my mind that we would not be where we are now with respect to the cost of renewable energy if we didn't have such ambitious support policies in place in a relatively small number of countries. But since the crisis, it's hard to see that happening again. The one example that springs to mind is the Spanish example, where they had an incredibly ambitious, two examples, very briefly, because I think that raises the question of credibility. Spanish example, very generous system. They more or less expropriated from one day to the next. The implications that will have got rid of the system. It changed the system radically. The implications that will have in the longer term, if they want to introduce further incentives, will be very significant because investors don't want to be burned twice. The other example is the Italian regime, which came in just a few years ago, was seen to be so ambitious that none of the investors actually believed it would happen or would continue very long. And the response there was actually muted. And ultimately it was changed. So I think that there's ambition, but you can go too far with respect to ambition, particularly if you don't move together. And I think that's particularly true after 2009, of course.
Richard Hawkins, to put you on the spot, I wonder if you want to take a crack at that, thinking that you had rules at the top of your highest additionality in the policy mix. What examples can you think of?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's informal rulemaking, or sometimes it's rulemaking where you don't expect it. I guess an example that someone always pointed out to me, for what it's worth, is a catalytic converter, which Detroit resisted with all of its being. It said it would ruin the industry. There couldn't possibly be that amount of research and development. They couldn't pry the capital loose and all this kind of thing. And in fact, it was the salvation of the whole industry, because in doing the catalytic converter, they had to rethink the entire automobile. And guess what? They became competitive again for a brief period anyway with the Japanese and Europeans. So there's an example of rulemaking. It doesn't, this was just a decision by the state of California as the biggest market in the U.S. for automobiles, that we're not going to allow cars on our roads with our license plates that don't have catalytic converters in them. So that's an example. But I'm a little bit, I'm going to dissent a little bit on this demand thing, and I appreciate what Richard has said here, and I'm going to contextualize this because I'm not an expert in energy, and the demand dynamic could be very different in this sector, and I'm willing to say that that's so, and I'm willing to be flexible on this. But I would just point out that there are all kinds of innovations out there, really significant ones, for which it would be very, very difficult to trace them back to somebody demanding this. And indeed, the very first theory of innovation is a theory of entrepreneurship, which says that the job of an entrepreneur is to create demand. And not just fulfill a market, not just create more of something or create it more efficiently, but to actually convince the market to accept something that it never even knew existed before, let alone wanted. A good example is television. Raymond Williams, the famous historian of technology, philosopher of technology, wrote a history of television back in the 1970s and said, this is this great invention, this great innovation, for which no one ever expressed demand. But once everyone saw it, everyone wanted it. We were talking about diffusion last night. And I'm thinking that, if we actually see diffusion in something new, like a new technology, a new practice, a new policy, all of these things tend to be concomitant, they happen together. If we see a great deal of diffusion, by definition, there's demand there. So I have a difficult time sometimes separating demand out as being, it usually gets attached to this kind of push-pull idea, which I also kind of have a bit of trouble with, because it's so difficult to figure out when one of those is occurring and another one is not occurring, and so I'll just throw that into the mix. I'm not demurring entirely from their demand being a factor here, but I think it's much more complicated.
Well, you've thrown it into the mix, and someone has bit, Stuart. So
I just want to add one example to respond to that question. So I just came from Ontario, and there's been a couple of really great examples of clean water startup SME successes in Ontario, Xenon and Trojan in particular, in the last 10 years. Those primarily came out of the Walkerton inquiry. So talk about a crisis. So there was a crisis of water, you guys probably heard about. There was a very strong policy response by the government that set tough new watershed-based clean water rules, and that actually drove a couple of really impressive clean water startup firms in Ontario. So that's a really good, tangible example, which I think Jeanette probably swallowed up.
great. Yep.
Yeah, we did purchase Xenon. Yeah, GE acquired Xenon.
Okay, we'll go to Jeanette.
But my question actually is for Nick, because I wanted to there were a couple of things that came out both on the first panel and on the second panel here about whether or not we should be driving the building industries and that vertical model of innovation policy, or if we should be looking at the horizontal, doing it the way we do it now with more of a horizontal approach. And so I asked that question within the context of, your point that clean tech as an industry is very difficult to define, and that much of the environmental technology or the technology that will drive environmental benefits is not, green per se. Grid controls would never have typically been fallen under any government program for it wouldn't have met the criteria for any incentive program for green technology, yet it's critical to the integration of renewables onto the grid. And so I'm just curious how you view this. Should we in Canada be building a clean tech industry? What does that look like, or how should we accommodate the adjacencies in technology and the convergence of technology across industries?
That's an extremely good question, and in fact it occurred to me as I got to that slide, and I said, have I just contradicted myself? I don't think that I have. I mean, the first point is that your bedrock policy has to be the price on carbon and innovation, general innovation policies. In those areas for which, for various reasons, there are market failures and barriers which are quite significant, and for which the government is already present, then there's a complementary role that needs to be played. I live in a house which is 100 years old, and decisions were made at that time which are still affecting energy consumption. Now, I think what you need to think about is building regulations. First of all, building regulations which bear in mind the possibility of future innovation. Now, that's quite difficult, but bear in mind future innovations. The building that I have, it would be impossible for it to meet any standards that are in place now, and it doesn't do so. So I'm exempted. And I think that, so that's one question. It's rather a small point. But I do think that the whole question of whether or not, if we see that ICT is the most important thing for penetration of renewables, should that fall into some R&D tax incentive which is preferentially motivated, targeted? No, it shouldn't. Of course not. The point that I was trying to make there is that without a broad innovation structure, right, incentives for innovation, then these enabling technologies, which are so important, right, will not be available. So you need to invest in the grid in a manner which allows for the penetration of the intermittence, That's the point that I made about the building regulations. But that doesn't, at the same time, mean that you should have targeted incentives for all these different areas which could potentially have important and significant environmental benefits. It's a very tricky area, actually, because all of these general purpose technologies and enabling technologies of the kinds that we've characterized are ones for which the knowledge failures are often greatest. That's why our basic research is often frequently focused on those areas, right? So we are doing basic research in our labs, in the universities, and much of that is focusing on ICT, nano and biomaterial sciences, and those are the ones where the failures are greatest. But don't provide targeted incentives at the level of the firm because you think you're going to get an environmental benefit from it, even if that's the case. Probably the most incoherent answer you've ever heard in your life. But that was a reflection of the quality of the question.
Poor diplomat.
The gloves are off, folks.
No, high quality of the question. If it's a good question, you can't answer it.
Yeah. All right, we were expecting this to be a provocative panel. Obviously waded
Okay,
into that. All right, yes, go ahead.
My name is Elise Fisher, and I'm a student of Richard Hawkins. I'm doing my research is on Israeli innovation in energy, but I just want to make a comment. What Nick said regarding the important policies that are like protect IP, invest in higher education, invest in basic research, encourage collaboration. These are all characteristics of the policies in Israel, and they're very strongly implemented. And I'm not sure if I understood Richard well when he said that the policies that Israel has implemented haven't worked, because what I understood from Gili Fortuna, who works with the Samuel Nieman Institute, is that for the last 20 years they have worked very well, but now they will not be sustainable for the long term, so they have to change now from focusing on research and development to focusing on establishing the industries.
Anyone want to take a crack at that?
No, I think that's a clarification. If I said something different, that's exactly what I meant. But Elise very often says things better than I do.
Okay, we'll take that as a clarification. George, you had your hand up.
George Green with Stratos and the University of Ottawa. A lot of the discussion around here has been around policy, and I'd like to suggest a question around creating demand for policy. In Canada, we have an aversion to policy, or when we don't have an aversion to policy, governmental policy, we have very, very narrow policy that doesn't allow us to go to the kinds of integrative solutions that you were talking about as the needs. Any thoughts on how we can create a demand for the right kinds of policy in Canada?
Small catastrophe.
That starts it off. All right, Nick, small catastrophe.
Yeah, I'm not so sure a small catastrophe would start this. I think the thing about the catastrophe comment that Marcus made back then, it's fine to make that because he already knew he had all those algorithms and some of the early patents in his back pocket by 1970. They were already working on this in the mid-60s. They'd been involved in the digital technology when they were working on the early space program, the early satellite programs. In fact, that's kind of where some of this came from. So you have to be prepared to profit from a catastrophe. You can't just start with a catastrophe. Yeah. And I think this is where we might start seeing, as you say, a little bit of demand for policy change. I mean, the way you demand policy change is you change a government. But I mean,
we don't do that here in Alberta.
We have a problem here in Alberta. Yeah. We have a problem here in Alberta in that we've never actually tried democratic government, never even experiment in it. Okay, so I mean, we have a long way to go before we get to that point. But I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but I mean, but I am also being serious. I think the engagement of the citizenry in these critical kinds of arguments is really key. What are we arguing about Bill C-51 for? What are we arguing about a six-pack of CF-18s in Syria for? I wouldn't want to be one of those pilots, but is it going to affect Canada materially in any? No, absolutely not. Why should an election be fought on Mike Duffy? You know, I mean, there is an issue here with public engagement. We talk about social license. Where does that social license come from? I mean, I know, Ed, you are in this space an awful lot, trying to bring the public voice into these arguments. And I think that's really, really clear. I think if the public does manage to achieve a voice of some kind, then some of this demand will happen. So I think maybe a lot of the effort that we need to expend here is not to try and convince policymakers to do things, but to convince the public to get involved in or get engaged with some of these issues.
So Jeff wants to jump in, and not to direct your answer, but I'm wondering if you could touch upon some of the research that SP has done on how to do big policy changes, whether it be tobacco, eliminating the debt, early childhood education, only because I heard Stuart speak so convincingly about it a few months ago. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so,
Well, we might segue to Stuart for the last one.
Yeah, I might do that. One quick comment towards the question first is just, I mean, the demand for policy is important, but it's what I was trying to get to with my comment is the flip side of that is what type of policy response can we realistically expect to the demand given our current institutional setup? I mean, if what I'm hearing from a lot of the talk is we need things like policies that allow for exit, which means the policy has to allow for failure. How is our current institutional setup really respond to that? Can we expect policies that allow that? Are we properly evaluating how well the policies we have in place are actually performing to be able to allow these types of decisions to be made? And again, do the institutions we have in place allow these, provide an imperative to collect the data and do the analysis to really make those decisions? Do we want to see what would come out of that? A good example of this, I mean, Stuart keeps raising it, so I'll parrot off him, is SDTC. It's an arm's length institution that allows for riskier investments than you might see otherwise, and also that really targets leveraging private investment as well. So it's got a mandate of 2-to-1 investment from the private sector. And so it's the setup of an institution that maybe allows for a different response to policy demand than what we would have otherwise. So I would add that, and then if maybe Stuart would want to comment on more on the directive.
You can comment, Stuart, or you can give the last question to someone else, or you tell us to go to lunch.
I don't want to hold people back from lunch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very-
Well, let's give the last comment to Richard
one-
here.
One very quick comment in response to the question, which is, I think when individual people and companies see it in their self-interest to support a policy, that's when you'll see the policies adopted.
Great.